There was once a time when a simple act of kindness could change the fate of a kingdom, when a stranger's compassion could save a life, and when the warmth in one heart could melt away the suffering of many, but somewhere along the way, in the relentless rush of modern life, we forgot. Today, we scroll through endless images of tragedy and pain, numbed by their familiarity. We walk past one another, eyes glued to screens, hearts armored against a world we've learned to fear. In a time of infinite connection, we've never felt more alone. The art of compassion, the ancient, sacred practice of truly seeing, feeling, and caring for another's pain, has quietly faded from our daily lives. And with it, something essential within us has gone missing. Why does this matter now? Because, more than ever, we are a world in crisis. Rates of anxiety and depression have soared, families and friendships fracture over differences of opinion, nations are divided, and behind every conflict, every cruel word, every act of violence, is a wounded, unseen heart, crying out for understanding. But what if the antidote to this suffering isn't something new? What if it's something ancient? Something timeless. Something that has always been there, waiting for us to remember it. In the teachings of the Buddha, compassion, known as karuna, is not just a virtue. It is a force. A living, breathing energy that bridges the space between souls, that softens hatred, and dissolves the illusion of separation. It is not pity, it is not weakness. Compassion is the strength to face suffering without turning away, the courage to love in a world that can be cruel, the wisdom to recognize our shared humanity in every face we meet. And though our temples may crumble and our ancient sutras gather dust, the truth of compassion endures. In the Dhammapada, it is written, hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By love alone is hatred appeased. This is an eternal law. It's easy to dismiss this as poetic idealism, yet time and again, both ancient wisdom and modern science confirm the same truth. Compassion heals, it calms the racing mind, it lowers blood pressure, it dissolves stress. It even strengthens the immune system. But beyond biology, compassion restores meaning to our lives. It reminds us why we are here, not merely to consume, achieve, and compete, but to connect, to care, and to ease each other's burdens. Do you remember the last time someone truly saw you, not your job title, not your social media profile, not the mask you wear to survive each day, but you, your heart, your pain, your hope? That moment, however fleeting, is the medicine we all crave, and the beautiful secret is, we can offer that medicine to others, at any time, with a kind word, a gentle touch, a patient ear, a silent prayer. In one ancient story, a ferocious warlord came to a humble monastery, determined to burn it to the ground, but a single monk stood in his path, unarmed, unafraid. When the warlord roared, "Don't you know who I am? I can run you through without blinking an eye." The monk calmly replied, "And don't you know who I am? I can be run through without blinking an eye." In that instant, something cracked in the warlord's heart, compassion poured in, and history was rewritten. We, too, are standing at a crossroads, a chance to choose who we wish to be in this story, the indifferent bystander, the voice of cruelty, or the quiet light in another's dark night. This series, dear listener, is not about abstract philosophy. It's about you, your life, your choices, your ability to become an agent of compassion in a world that desperately needs it. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore what true compassion means in Buddhist thought, the barriers that keep us from practicing it, and the small, practical ways we can bring it back into our daily lives. Because compassion isn't something we have, it's something we practice. And like any art, the more we offer it, the more it shapes us. So if you've ever felt the ache of loneliness, if you've ever longed to matter, if you've ever wished the world could be softer, kinder, more human, then this journey is for you. Are you ready to remember? As we step further into this journey, let's pause for a moment and ask a simple question: what is compassion, really? Is it just a fleeting emotion when we see someone suffer? Is it pity, sympathy, or something much deeper? Something sacred? To answer this, we turn to one of the most profound wisdom traditions in history, the teachings of the Buddha, over 2,600 years ago, beneath the shade of a Bodhi tree, a prince-turned-wanderer named Siddhartha Gautama awakened to a truth so powerful, it would echo through centuries, that suffering exists, and that liberation from it is possible. But how do we approach the suffering of others? What should we do when faced with another person's pain? Knowing full well we cannot erase all the sorrows of this world, the Buddha taught that while we may not end all suffering, we can choose how we meet it, and the noblest way to meet suffering is with karuna, compassion. In Buddhist philosophy, compassion is far more than an emotional response. It is one of the four immeasurables, or Brahmaviharas, the sublime states of mind that uplift both the one who gives and the one who receives. These four immeasurables are metta, loving kindness; karuna, compassion; mudita, sympathetic joy; upekkha, equanimity. Together, they form the spiritual heart of Buddhist practice, a timeless guide to living with wisdom and grace in a world often marked by turmoil. But what makes karuna so powerful? Unlike pity, which sees another's suffering from a distance, compassion invites us to recognize our shared humanity. It says, "Your pain is my pain. Your joy is my joy. I do not turn away." It acknowledges the Buddhist truth of dukkha, that life, by its very nature, contains suffering, and from this understanding, a profound empathy is born. In one ancient story, a young mother named Kisa Gautami lost her only child. Desperate, blinded by grief, she carried the tiny, lifeless body from house to house, begging for medicine that might bring him back. Finally, she reached the Buddha. He listened quietly, then told her, "I can help you, but first, bring me a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." Hopeful, Kisa ran from door to door, but in every home, she heard stories of lost fathers, mothers, sisters, and sons. And slowly, she understood, suffering touches all lives. It was in this realization, that she was not alone in her grief, that her healing began. This story is not merely about death. It's about how compassion rises when we truly see one another, when we allow the walls between my pain and yours to dissolve. The Buddha often emphasized that compassion isn't passive, it's active. It moves us to ease suffering where we can, and to hold space for it when we cannot. Even a quiet, steady presence beside a suffering soul can be a form of profound compassion, and importantly, compassion doesn't ask us to fix everything. It asks us to show up. In the Metta Sutta, one of Buddhism's most cherished texts, it is written, "Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings." Think about that. A love so vast, so fearless, that it embraces all creatures, even those who have wronged us. This is where true compassion differs from mere sentiment. It is not selective. It extends to friends and enemies, to the joyful and the wicked, to the seen and unseen. It teaches us to respond, not react, to understand, not judge. Modern psychology now confirms what the Buddha intuited centuries ago, that compassion rewires the brain, softens the heart, and fosters resilience. It even improves physical health, reducing inflammation, lowering stress hormones, and enhancing immune function. But beyond science, compassion awakens a sacred part of us. It reminds us of our deepest nature, interconnected, tender, courageous, and like any wisdom, compassion must be cultivated. The Buddha taught practices like karuna bhavana, the meditation of compassion, where one silently repeats wishes of well-being for others. May you be free from suffering, may you find peace, may you experience joy, starting with ourselves, then extending to loved ones, to strangers, and yes, even to those we struggle to forgive, because in the eyes of compassion, no one is unworthy. Imagine for a moment, a world where each of us, even once a day, pause to offer a silent blessing to someone in pain, a world where anger paused, where cruelty hesitated, where kindness spoke first. This is not naive optimism, it's the wisdom of countless generations, of masters and monks, mothers and farmers, warriors and scholars, all who found refuge in the fierce, unyielding grace of compassion. And so, dear listener, as we move forward, the question is not, do you have compassion? But rather, are you willing to remember it? Because it is already within you, buried beneath fear, beneath distraction, beneath the hardened armor of modern life, waiting, patiently, to be awakened. So far, we've remembered the ancient wisdom of compassion, and felt its quiet, undeniable power, but if compassion is so natural, so healing, so essential to the human spirit, why is it so difficult to practice? Why do we turn away from suffering? Why do we harden our hearts when the world cries out? Why do we withhold kindness, even from ourselves? The truth is, the path of compassion, like any path worth walking, is filled with obstacles, not because compassion is weak, but because our fears are strong, and to truly reclaim this lost art, we must first understand what stands in its way. The Buddha taught that the mind is like a garden. If left untended, weeds of greed, hatred, and delusion quickly overtake it. These inner poisons cloud our vision, numb our hearts, and make us forget what it means to feel deeply. The first great obstacle is fear, fear of being hurt, fear of being overwhelmed by another's pain, fear that if we open ourselves to suffering, it will swallow us whole. In a world that teaches us to stay safe, to stay detached, to armor up, compassion feels risky, but the irony is, the more we shield ourselves from the pain of others, the more isolated, anxious, and hollow we become. The Buddha reminded us that compassion isn't about drowning in the sorrow of the world, it's about standing firm in the storm, with a heart steady enough to care. The second obstacle is judgment. We live in a world obsessed with labels: good, bad, deserving, undeserving, friend, enemy. When we judge others, we create distance. We convince ourselves that some lives are worth our compassion, and others are not. But true compassion transcends judgment. As the Buddha said, just as the great earth does not discriminate between the pure and the impure, the beautiful and the ugly, so too must the compassionate heart embrace all beings. Yes, even those we find difficult, even those who've wronged us. The third obstacle is indifference. Modern life moves fast. We are bombarded with images of suffering, famine, war, injustice, until our hearts grow numb. It's a protective reflex, and in small doses, it makes sense, but unchecked, it erodes our humanity. The Buddha called this spiritual blindness, a forgetting of our interconnectedness. When we no longer feel the sorrow of others, we lose a piece of ourselves. The fourth obstacle is self-centeredness. Let's be honest, in the busyness of survival, our own struggles can consume us. We become so preoccupied with our problems, our deadlines, our anxieties, that we forget to look up, to see the people quietly hurting beside us. But as the Buddha taught, clinging too tightly to the self only deepens suffering. Compassion softens the walls of ego. It reminds us that our joy is bound to the joy of others, and ironically, it is in caring for others that we often find relief for our own burdens. The final obstacle is despair. Sometimes, the suffering in this world feels endless, and we wonder, what difference can one person make? The Buddha understood this temptation to turn away. He warned against what he called compassion fatigue. But he also taught that even a single act of kindness ripples out in unseen ways, that we do not have to fix the whole world. We only have to tend to the small circle of life we touch. In one ancient parable, a monk walking along a beach filled with stranded starfish bent down to toss a single one back into the ocean. A passerby laughed. What difference will it make? There are thousands. The monk smiled. It makes a difference to this one. And so it is with compassion. It begins small, with one gesture, one kind word, one silent prayer, but to practice it fully, we must first clear the obstacles in our path. How? By noticing when fear tightens our chest, when judgment clouds our gaze, when indifference dulls our empathy, when self-absorption blinds us, when despair tempts us to give up, and gently, without harshness, return to the truth, that compassion is not a burden, but a homecoming. The Buddha often described the path of awakening as a gradual clearing away of ignorance, layer by layer, stone by stone, until the heart shines clear. This is our task, to meet these obstacles not with shame, but with understanding, not with guilt, but with patience, because even the obstacles themselves, once seen clearly, can become our teachers. As the Zen saying goes, the obstacle is the path. Up until now, we've explored what compassion truly means, and the quiet obstacles that keep us from living it fully, but the question remains, how do we actually practice compassion? In this busy, messy, often overwhelming modern life, not in a monastery, not on a remote mountain, but right here, in traffic jams, crowded offices, stressful family dinners, and scrolling news feeds filled with both hope and heartbreak, because if compassion only exists in theory, it's like a seed never planted, it needs to be lived, felt, expressed, in the rawness of ordinary moments. The Buddha understood this well. He often reminded his followers that awakening happens not just on the meditation cushion, but in how we treat one another in the simplest interactions. So today, let's explore how to turn compassion into a living, breathing practice, not through grand gestures, but through small, steady, intentional acts. First, begin where you are, with yourself. It might sound strange, but many of us are far kinder to strangers than to our own hearts. We criticize ourselves harshly, we replay our mistakes, we carry invisible burdens of guilt, shame, and unworthiness. The Buddha taught that compassion must start within, not as a selfish act, but as a foundation. Because a heart hardened against itself cannot fully open to others. A simple practice, at the end of each day. Pause for a moment, place a hand over your chest, take a deep breath, and silently say to yourself, I see your struggles, I forgive your flaws, you, too, are worthy of kindness. This isn't weakness, it's courage, and it's the first spark of authentic compassion. Next, bring compassion into your small, daily encounters. When you stand in a long line and feel irritation rising, pause, look around, notice the elderly woman's tired eyes, the young father rocking his restless child, the cashier's forced smile. Each person carries their own unseen battles, and in that moment, you have a choice: react or respond. Offer a warm glance, a gentle word, a silent blessing. These tiny moments ripple in ways we cannot measure. The Buddha once said, drop by drop, the water pot is filled. So too with compassion. Then, widen the circle, send a kind message to a friend you've lost touch with, offer a helping hand without waiting to be asked. Listen, really listen, when someone speaks, without planning your reply. In traffic, let someone merge in front of you. When you witness an act of cruelty online, resist the urge to add fuel to the fire. Instead, be a quiet presence of empathy amid the noise. And remember, compassion isn't always soft. Sometimes it means setting boundaries, speaking difficult truths, holding space for someone's grief without rushing to fix it. The Buddha taught skillful means, knowing when to comfort, when to challenge, when to stay silent, and when to act. Compassion is wisdom in motion. Another daily practice is mindful attention. Compassion often arises when we truly see others, but in our distracted world, we rarely do. Take a walk and notice the weathered tree, the stray cat, the old man sitting alone. Feel the pulse of life around you. In these simple acts of noticing, compassion naturally stirs, because the more we pay attention, the more we remember, we belong to one another. And don't forget to include those you find difficult. The Buddha never promised this would be easy, but he urged his followers to extend compassion even to enemies, even to those who have hurt us, not to condone harm, but to free ourselves from the bitterness that poisons our hearts. A powerful practice. Think of someone you struggle with. Close your eyes. Imagine them as a small child, frightened, misunderstood, reaching for love in clumsy, painful ways, and silently offer, may you be free from suffering, may you find peace, may you feel safe. At first, it may feel impossible, but over time, it softens the sharp edges within us. Lastly, practice compassion for the world itself. Our planet cries out in countless ways, in withered forests, polluted waters, and species disappearing unnoticed. Compassion means living with awareness of our impact. It means choosing kindness not just for humans, but for all beings. As the Buddha said, all tremble at violence, all fear death. See yourself in others. Then whom can you hurt? What harm can you do? We don't need to save the world overnight, but every small act matters. Recycle that bottle, support ethical choices, speak up when injustice rises, offer your hands, your time, your presence, because compassion is not an abstract virtue, it's 1,000 small decisions, made quietly, every single day. And here's the beautiful secret the Buddha knew: the more compassion you offer, the lighter your own heart becomes, the less isolated you feel, the more life begins to glow, not because it is perfect, but because you are awake to its raw, aching, exquisite beauty. By now, we've explored the profound beauty of offering compassion to others, in small acts, in silent prayers, in the way we move through the world with kindness, but there's a crucial truth we cannot skip, a truth the Buddha quietly emphasized, though we so often forget: you cannot pour from an empty cup. Compassion, like a flame, must be tended within before it can be shared without. And so today, we turn inward, to the art. And it is an art, of self-compassion, for many of us. This is the hardest form of kindness to practice. We've been conditioned to believe that caring for ourselves is indulgent, that forgiveness must be earned, that worth is tied to success, productivity, perfection, but the Buddha taught otherwise. He reminded his followers that all beings, including ourselves, are worthy of tenderness. In the Metta Sutta, one of Buddhism's most beloved teachings, it says, "Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings," and that includes the one being you so often neglect, yourself. Why is self-compassion so difficult? Because we are hardest on ourselves. We carry invisible burdens of guilt, shame, and disappointment. We replay our mistakes, we measure ourselves against impossible standards, and yet, the Buddha understood the danger of this inner cruelty. He taught that harshness toward oneself inevitably spills out as harshness toward others, that when we're at war inside, peace outside becomes impossible. So, how do we begin? First, by noticing. Start to pay attention to the way you speak to yourself, the quiet, cutting voice that whispers, "You're not good enough, you always mess things up, you don't deserve kindness." Notice it, name it, and gently ask, "Would I ever speak this way to a dear friend?" If the answer is no, then it's time to soften. The second step is permission. Give yourself permission to be flawed, to have days when you're exhausted, angry, lost, to not have all the answers. The Buddha never promised a life without struggle. What he offered was a path through it, guided by understanding, patience, and compassion, a powerful practice. The next time you catch yourself spiraling in self-criticism, pause, place your hand over your heart, take a steady breath, and whisper, "It's okay, love. You're doing the best you can." These simple words, repeated often, begin to carve new pathways in the mind. Pathways of gentleness where once there was judgment. Third, embrace your humanity. We live in a culture obsessed with perfection, but the Buddha taught that to be human is to be imperfect, to stumble, to fall, to forget, and then to remember. In Buddhist philosophy, the Japanese art of kintsugi offers a beautiful metaphor. When a piece of pottery breaks, it is not discarded. Instead, it's mended with gold. The cracks highlighted rather than hidden. The result is something more beautiful for having been broken. You too are allowed to have cracks. They do not make you less, they make you whole. Fourth, create rituals of care. Self-compassion isn't just a thought, it's a practice. Light a candle at the end of a long day, sit in silence for 5 minutes, speak kindly to yourself in the mirror, take a mindful walk without a destination, write a letter of forgiveness to the younger version of you. The Buddha understood the importance of daily rituals, not for their grandeur, but for their grounding. They remind us to return to ourselves. Fifth, release the myth of constant strength. We admire resilience, but the Buddha taught that true strength lies not in never breaking, but in how gently we hold ourselves when we do. When sorrow visits, let it. When fear rises, notice it. When loneliness wraps around you, offer yourself the tenderness you would to a wounded child. And most importantly, practice metta, loving kindness meditation. This ancient practice invites us to silently repeat, "May I be safe, may I be well, may I be peaceful, may I live with ease." Then, gradually extend these wishes outward, to loved ones, strangers, difficult people, and finally the entire world. But always, always begin with yourself. The Buddha was clear, we cannot offer to others what we deny within. Compassion for yourself is not separate from compassion for the world. It's the root from which all kindness grows. And here's the quiet secret: when you practice self-compassion, you soften the fear inside you. And when fear softens, love expands, and when love expands, you move through the world differently. You become steadier in the storm, more generous in your presence, more courageous in your compassion, not because life is easier, but because your heart has learned to stay open. We've come a long way together, from understanding compassion's forgotten importance, to recognizing what blocks it, to gently learning how to extend it toward others and ourselves. But what happens when we truly live with compassion, when it's not just a fleeting feeling, but a way of moving through the world? The Buddha taught that compassion isn't just a virtue, it's a force, a transformative, tangible, life-altering force. And modern science, in many ways, has begun to catch up to what sages knew centuries ago. Studies show that people who regularly practice compassion experience measurable changes in their brain chemistry, neuroimaging reveals. Increased activity in areas linked to empathy, positive emotion, and resilience. Stress hormones decrease, sleep improves, blood pressure stabilizes. But beyond these statistics lies something deeper, something the ancient masters understood without MRI scans and heart rate monitors. Compassion changes the heart. It changes the way we see ourselves, each other, and this fleeting, precious life. First, it transforms the way we experience suffering. When we approach our pain, and the pain of others, with compassion rather than judgment, everything softens. The sharp edges of grief become bearable. The sting of failure turns into a lesson, not a life sentence. The fear of loneliness becomes an opportunity to reconnect. The Buddha compared compassion to a soothing balm applied to a burning wound. The pain may still exist, but its intensity lessens, and healing begins. Second, compassion rewires our relationships. We stop seeing people as obstacles or tools for our own gain. We begin to sense the invisible struggles behind short tempers and cold stares, and in those moments, we gain a sacred power, the ability to respond with kindness when it's least expected. Friendships deepen, conflicts resolve more gently, the heavy walls we've built between ourselves and others quietly dissolve. The Buddha once said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love." This is the eternal rule. Compassion is the bridge we build back to each other. Third, compassion dissolves the illusion of separateness. The modern world encourages us to think in terms of me versus them, my problems, my family, my success, my survival. But compassion reminds us of a deeper truth, that our joys and sorrows are woven together, that the stranger across the street, the refugee half a world away, the bird in the tree, and you, are all threads in the same fabric of existence. And when we pull on one, the whole tapestry moves. This isn't just poetic philosophy, it's an invitation to live more awake. To realize that every small act of kindness ripples outward in ways you'll never fully see. Fourth, compassion gives meaning to suffering. Life will never be free of difficulty. The Buddha made this clear in his very first teaching. Life contains suffering, but compassion transforms suffering from a meaningless burden into an opportunity for connection, growth, and wisdom. When we suffer, we learn to soften toward others in pain. When we fall, we understand how to lift someone else. As the poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Compassion helps us see that light. Fifth, compassion deepens our sense of purpose. When we live only for ourselves, life feels narrow, even achievements feel hollow. But when we extend ourselves in kindness, whether through a listening ear, a gentle word, or a courageous act, we step into something larger than our personal dramas. The Buddha often spoke of living for the benefit of all beings, not because it was noble, but because it was freedom. Freedom from ego, from isolation, from the endless, anxious striving for significance. Compassion reminds us, we matter, because we belong to each other. Lastly, compassion softens our final days. In Buddhism, the greatest fear isn't death itself, it's dying with a heart filled with bitterness, regret, and unresolved pain. A life of compassion prepares us for the inevitable. It allows us to meet old age with grace, to hold the hands of loved ones without fear, to look back on our days not with pride or shame, but with quiet gratitude. The Buddha taught that at the moment of death, the mind seeks comfort, and a heart long practiced in compassion finds peace more easily than one hardened by anger. This is the final gift of compassion. It is a companion at life's end, and so, what begins as a small, daily practice, a kind word, a forgiving thought, a quiet prayer for a stranger, becomes, over time, the very shape of our existence, a life softened by tenderness, a heart brave enough to stay open, a spirit vast enough to hold both joy and sorrow. This is the life. The Buddha spoke of a life not perfect, but wise, not painless, but deeply meaningful. As we reach the close of this journey into compassion, let's take a moment to breathe deeply, to feel the ripple of kindness spreading through our thoughts, our hearts, and our actions. Compassion is not just a concept tucked away in ancient texts, it is alive, pulsing through the very fabric of our lives, in every smile offered to a stranger, in every patient word spoken to a friend, in every moment we choose understanding over judgment. The world changes. One small act of compassion can ignite 1,000 others, and together, these sparks light the darkness. Imagine a world where compassion is our default, not the exception, where kindness is currency, where connection is the foundation of society, where suffering is met with care, and every being is honored simply for being. This is not a distant dream, it is a vision the Buddha shared thousands of years ago, and it is a vision we can embody, here and now. The path of compassion is a daily practice, a commitment to see the humanity in ourselves and in others, a pledge to soften our hearts in a world that often demands hardness. As you go forward, remember, every choice you make matters, every moment is a chance to choose love over fear, understanding over division, compassion over indifference. If this journey has touched your heart, I invite you to carry this message forward, to share it, reflect on it, and live it. And if you found value here, please consider subscribing to this channel. Together, we can build a community rooted in wisdom, kindness, and the timeless teachings of the Buddha. Hit the like button if compassion resonates with you, leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. I would love to hear your story, and share this video with those who might need a gentle reminder that kindness still matters. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your days be filled with light, peace, and boundless compassion. Until next time, may you be well, may you be happy, may you live with ease.